Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first BookBlast Translation Book Club of the year, at which we're featuring Hiromi Kawakami's Record of a Night Too Brief, translated by Lucy North, published by Pushkin Press. Record of a Night Too Brief is a collection of 3 surreal novellas imbued with a particular kind of magical realism that veer at times into the absurd, creating a tapestry of strange poetic imagery and a resonant exploration of identity, love and loss. What is real? What is a dream? The boundaries are blurred. The first novella, Record of a Night Too Brief, is a surreal journey through a single night that is fleeting yet eternal. The unnamed narrator has a series of very bizarre dreamlike experiences encountering strange figures and surreal situations. The narrator's identity shifts and fragments. Time and space are fluid, conveying the fleeting nature of existence. The illogical progression of the narrative reflects the fragmented and mutable nature of dreams. Is connection possible in a chaotic, fragmented, impermanent world? Missing, the second novella, follows the fate of a family coping with the disappearance of a brother. Despite his physical absence, the brother continues to exert an uncanny presence as though he is neither fully gone nor fully present. It is a world in which the boundaries between the living and the absent blur. How do loss and grief impact memories of loved ones? The last novella, A Snake Stepped On, is a story about transformation and the supernatural. The protagonist steps on a snake which turns into a woman and insinuates herself into the protagonist's life. A bizarre and unsettling relationship develops as the snake woman exerts an increasing influence on the protagonist's actions and thoughts, culminating in a sense of entrapment. The snake woman embodies shifting identities and the fluidity of the self. The protagonist's loss of autonomy is a reflection of how freedom and control can play out in relationships. There are bizarre human and non-human elements in the narrative. I've always loved the tradition of surrealism in British literature and culture in the works of Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll and Monty Python and many others, so I was curious to find out about Japanese surrealism, since arguably both traditions share an affinity for challenging conventional logic and real-time perceptions, much as their cultural context and stylistic expressions are very different.
The one that I connected to reality, because skin irritation, the worst at night.
The itching, yeah.
The itching.
Excellent.
So, during the day it's almost, for whatever reason, at night falls, the itchiness becomes, more and more, to the point of from the unbearable. So the more you scratch, the more it itches, and the more it itches, the more it scratches.
Yeah.
You actually, always comes to a pleasure, kind of a pleasure, and you think, who gets the best pleasure, the place that it itches or the hand that is itching? It's so realistic because, and it drives you absolutely mentally, It just, you go despair, and you stop scratching until point of bleeding. So that is kind of a very realistic, to me that's the first thing.
I think there were kind of 2 threads for me. So one was this girl on an adventure at night meeting this animalistic creatures, monsters and everything. And then there's a lot of shape-shifting. And then the second thread is this relationship of this protagonist and the girl. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was also quite realistic, and it was almost showing like different stages of a relationship. Yeah. There was like this kind of honeymoon stage where they were kissing and quite intense, and then it was like bargaining, like she or he went to the boss to get the girl back, and then at the end they were like not even recognizing each other. I think the last words were like, were you always that kind of thing? So I thought that was quite metaphoric about it.
One story was some animalistic, almost unconnected thing, and the next one would be the relationship between these two characters. And I was looking forward to the next one with those girls.
Oh, the mushrooms, Israel.
Actually, what the whole age might be like or described like, and I found that description with the most, the brightest for me, and the most visual and standing up in memory. That one. Another one about expression of love, by moving from the real description of feelings into images is breathtaking. For me, it was breathtaking.
Now we have Nicky Harman here, who translates from Chinese. So
but
and then we have two translators.
Yes.
Nicky, now let's hear what you want to say.
I couldn't possibly talk from the point of view of translation because I don't know any Japanese. I thought it read so fluently, you couldn't tell it was a translation. And
That's
to be
the
honest,
hallmark of a good translation.
I think
isn't it?
that's the sign of a good translation, that it doesn't bring you up short and think, I might think to myself, well, that sounds as if it was originally in French, Spanish, another language. Chinese, you can always tell if it's not very well translated because you can tell the sentence structure where it's come from. But so I wasn't reading it from that point of view at all. I was reading it as I agree with what you've the rest of you have said so far. I think what really struck me was the moments of pure horror and the mushrooms. I just got it because I got it on Kindle. Here it is, peeping out from the strands of hair at the nape of her neck were what looked like mushrooms. Tiny red mushrooms with flattened caps. It's yucky. So really horrifying, but also very lyrical, wonderful translations of descriptions, wonderful descriptions of nature. In some bits, very funny, and as I think you said, about love, about feelings, viewed in a slightly different, fantastical way. It really reminded me of two other writers. One was Lewis Carroll. It's so Alice Through the Looking Glass or Alice in Wonderland. People just never do normal things.
And they change shapes.
And
Alice shrinks.
Yes.
One of them, she shrinks and she nearly drowns in her own tears. She's so upset. You know, there's
that's Borges. That's a squonk.
Yes, but it's also Alice. You see that. So what Borges exactly. So it's interesting when you see
So you wonder
these things
whether
across
the author was
human
actually influenced.
Well, there's
by
what is it? The collective unconscious, all that stuff. But, you know,
But the other author was a woman from Hong Kong called Dorothy Tse.
Dorothy
Tse, T-S-E.
Okay.
Snow and Shadow was the name of the collection, published some years ago, and I translated these short stories.
Right.
And there's a lot which is very similar. So maybe there are some common threads between Chinese and Japanese surrealism, or they've read each other's stories. Who knows? How do these elements travel?
Exactly.
Actually, it's interesting, the mushroom, a linguistic question, having talked about itching and the itching skin, and the fact that champignon in French it's a rash.
Yes.
Chi rash is the same word as the word for mushrooms, and the the dream aspect to this novel. So the mushrooms would. But I wonder. I don't speak Japanese. I wonder, is there a relationship in Japanese between skin rashes and mushrooms?
Particularly in Portuguese, we don't call mushrooms, we call champignon.
Yeah,
champignon. Because it comes from the French language.
Really champignon. It is fungi. Well, actually, also that's something else in terms of nature and ecology. There's that everyone's very keen on mushrooms and fungi and their hidden world. This is what's interesting. We're talking about surrealism, whether it's Japanese, are the common threads. That's the sort of human across the board and how it comes out in such extraordinary different variety. But I was also intrigued. I was interested with the family missing. So how much do you learn also about families and traditions and the whole thing, and this whole thing about getting married, and then the sister longing, and there's obviously a desire for some kind of intimacy and touch. I mean,
well, it's actually fascinating from that point. It's almost straightforward that you can actually read through as a whole piece of work.
Then there's a whole undertow.
And there is a lot of culture, a lot of tradition underneath. And the actual, sort of what strikes me, even in some countries in Europe, where the even number, it's almost regarded as unlucky. The 5 number, it's quite, sort of, so it's the odd number that is, brings luck more or less, rather than the even number. For example, sort of in Balkan culture, in Macedonian culture, you don't take even number of flowers to a person. So you
Yeah.
always take an odd number, sort of even number if you go to a funeral. So there is
numerology, yes. What also is interesting and missing is this whole thing about the Japanese culture is famous for its sort of sacrificial aspect, because it's a very odd thing about the marriage and then the father, and they're eaten by the insects.
Yes.
And they sacrifice themselves for the apartment block. During the festival season, we're visited by swarms of insects, and the residents of the apartment complex are always concerned about what steps to take against them. The insects are as large as a person's thumb and like a rhinoceros beetle. So the father and brother number 2, there's this huge festival, they're swarms, these insects swarm all over them, and they get these frightful scabs. And then it says, my father and my brother number 2 took to their hammocks and didn't get up for a whole month. But I mean, sacrifice is a feature in a lot of cultures in many ways, of course.
I found that part of that story, the brother number 1 disappeared, so she married number 2. Actually, the least fantastical, it seemed to me perfectly normal. Seeing as the marriage had been arranged anyway, what was the difference?
And they paid for the the matrimonial agency. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
I think for that story, that secondary story about the wife who is becoming that small and losing herself, it was the most interesting for me, to be honest with you. Forget about that loss. We read about many stories about how we feel lost and so on. But the story about a woman so lost in the relationship and in herself and becoming so small, and she's trapped, she can't go anywhere, there are conventions and restrictions of the society. Losing herself to becoming that small in size, they had to put her in the tiny glass to lose her. Versus how it was happening was really, very, again, visually riveting for me. That's amazingly written. But with all that, having said all that, I still feel myself as a foreigner in different country. This is the Japanese culture, Chinese culture, highly contextualized. You have to know things, and this is the wisdom which is part of the culture from generation to generation. And it's not something you can pick up from the books, I think. You just, you know it or you don't know it. You've lived there or it's been explained to you. And there's also the story of the wife of the owner. Yes, so she had a snake. And
That's
was the escapism to escape the situation. This is how I read it, anyway. What is happening there.
And then she's devastated when the snake dies.
But to touch on the feminism, and this is where the priest, actually, the Buddhist priest, and he's very misogynist in his description. He sort of said, "Oh, you marry a snake," and
How many times has that been said?
A woman is a snake.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
On the
It
other
is quite.
hand, so she doesn't talk too much. And I thought,
Classic. A woman who's a bit lippy and who chatterbox. Yeah, we know that. I know.
She doesn't
know
act
your
so
place.
bad, and basically she's been, sort of the snake. She does all the charm, sort of the sexual aspect of the snake. And
there's all this thing about the snake draping itself over the shoulders.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah, that's one subject. I mean, I find these stories incredibly sexualized on so many levels, but I didn't know whether.
Very easy read. I mean, slightly odd, disturbing at certain points. But it is. Every culture has its interest in nature and the spirits and the supernatural and the duality of good and evil and ghosts and metamorphosis. And the Japanese have, I don't know, for me anyway, they have a pretty extraordinary way of dealing with it in their literature and films.
I think is this story falling into the category of magical realism, right?
But it is sort of magical realism, Japanese style.
Japanese style, I'm just thinking about like the kind of classical magical realism of like Latin America.
But that's so different. I mean, this is what's interesting. In traditional fairy tales and things, you have people flying through the night and shape shifting. Do you have actually in Russian culture? You have a lot of the turning into. The Baba Yaga lays an egg. That there's a whole lot of changing into. We all have different sides of ourselves, so you might see one aspect and there's another aspect. So you said to portray it in different ways rather than
Yeah.
the typical.
But then
Yeah.
if we're talking about the translation, what I wonder is what is missing here and what was in the book. Because when the snake starts talking to the woman and calls her name, I think there was phonetically some different connection there, sort of reminding, bringing different depth to it, which we can't quite appreciate somehow. And we're talking about the numbers, for example. I know that in Japan culture,
Numerology.
it is numerology. It's all again phonetically connected. So, for example, 4 somehow is close to death, and they wouldn't have number 4, and they would avoid it.
But that's to do with the kanji. I mean, that's to do with the. It's nothing actually to do with the connection between 4 and death. It's that the two characters sound the same, even though they're completely different characters. So in Chinese, it's actually different tone.
Right.
But you mustn't have the number because it means someone is going to die. But 8 is a good number. 8 is a lucky number because it sounds ba, fa. Ba meaning 8, fa meaning that you get rich. So it's that kind of connection.
Yes.
But as the translator doesn't explain it, I assume, you have that idea, but you're not quite sure what the connection is. Yes.
The interesting thing, sort of, particularly in this book, is, how day and night, how they appear, sort of. Night is a world of its own, and it's completely, night we see differently, our vision is almost impaired and we adjust to it. We dream differently, sort of night dreams, whatever. So if this is during the day, sort of, I'm not talking about daydreams, but dreams during the day. The sleep is different. So nightlife, it's a life or world of its own. So hence the imagination. I mean, I remember as a child, and this was, sort of, it's frightening, sort of, imagine, sort of, the shadow that it's actually eating people, sort of, because how the night would portray, sort of various things, and adjustment to, sort of, to the, it's like when we see things at night without the lights, in the darkness, so you always see shadows, you cannot actually adjust to certain things. So all the, the perception of night and day, how different it is.
To add to your point that it's kind of all like a dream, I thought that there were quite a few clues for me that was a kind of a dream that we were reading through the first novella. So first clue was that whenever she was trying to shout but no words emerged from her mouth, that to me read like sleep paralysis. And then the second bit was right after it in the next chapter, I think. There was a door, and I think the door is like a common thread, like when you're like lucid dreaming, you're like supposed to find a door and then you kind of enter a different dream. I think that's a common sort of thing that happens when you're lucid dreaming, you're supposed to look for a door. And for me that was all kind of, and I think what was interesting about the first novella is the time being also a matter, the night not just being the time as we perceive it, but being also a coffee and a liquid and something that the boss is working with and something that can be reverted. So I think that's the common thread of magical realism, like the perception of time is very different to what we know.
Exactly,
I have a more sort of general question since we're in a translated book club. But I've noticed that sometimes, when I read a book in translation, maybe not French or Spanish or German, there's a little story in the beginning, a little story about the author, and, this author fits into this category, follows on, another South African author or another Japanese author. And I'm just wondering, I would have liked to have known a bit more about her, the reception of the book. I saw it came out 30 years ago, so she was only 35 when she wrote it. But I would have liked to a little bit more about the context. Did she win any prizes for it?
And it's been translated into a lot of languages. I can't remember, a lot. So it's done very, very well. And she's had various novels out. And she's a new, though it's quite, she's a new, younger generation coming up. there is, one feels there's a certain hinterland tradition behind her. There are other novels published, and this isn't the only book of hers that's been translated.
But again,
and Pushkin are quite good about following through with authors. They don't only publish one hoping it'll work. I mean, I'm afraid some publishers are like that, aren't they? They'll just publish one and hope it sticks. And we know good publishing, better for the author to have 2 or 3 books out, because you build up a following and an interest, and the critics begin to take notice. There's a sort of practical side to it. So Pushkin are quite good about following through.
I wonder if this is almost deliberate, so her work speaks for her.
There was so little on the wiki page. It was amazing.
There are 2 ways of looking at it. One is that, too much information will be very off-putting to a number of readers. Not everybody wants all that information. The whole thing about footnotes, but I agree, but there's also, there's the question of, as you're translating, you do try to, you try to gloss surreptitiously. You try to put, slip in little bits and pieces.
Little nuggets, that's right. So
that do clarify some of these points without it standing out like a sore thumb. So, but I take your point, especially with for example, Japanese literature. I mean, knowing that the language, for example, has got this all these honorifics and the hierarchy. How much of that must be? It's bad enough dealing with French to English with the question of the intimate voice and the more formal voice, which we don't have in English. The second half, but English doesn't. So, but I do know enough about Japanese to know that that it's all much more complex. And I'm wondering how all these different fantastical creatures in this book are addressing each other. How much formality is, we don't know. And I'm also listening to what people are saying. It reminds me of when I went to Japan, this was 10 years ago now. One of the books I read about Japan was by an American called Alex Kerr, who had lived in Japan for a long time. And he wrote a rather lovely book called Lost Japan, where he talks about all the reasons why he loved Japanese culture, how he spent his life trying to understand it, collecting silk screens, studying the language. But he says at one point, and this is what really struck me, he said Japanese culture is really, and Japan itself, he describes it as a hapax. Now Nicky will tell us when I'm right about this. A hapax is a word that's applied to a character in Chinese, or a Chinese character, that cannot be understood because it's got no reference point. It's like a word in an ancient language, sort of thing, that it stands on its own, and unless you have some way into it, you can't crack it open. And that he feels that there's a great deal about Japanese culture and society that it's just like that. It's a one-off. There's nothing else like it. The reference points are very difficult to find, and it can be deeply baffling, but also utterly fascinating. And I think that's why people are drawn to manga culture, for example. It's one aspect of Japanese expression. It's so foreign to the Westerner, but it's so rich, and we want more of it. I don't know, it's deeply weird. It sounds very rich for a small book that is full of weird and wonderful ideas.
But actually, can I ask Nicky, okay, obviously Chinese, completely different ballgame to Japanese, but still, to a Western reader, what we're talking about, contextualizing introductions, etc. Do you, when you have translated or we worked with publishers, have they gone to the effort of doing some kind of intro or preface or afternote or something?
If they haven't asked, I almost always offer. Almost always offer, or because I think, sorry.
Do you want some water?
It's okay. Almost always there's cultural, historical, political background that makes your reading of a story so much richer if you understand it. I'll give you a very quick example. Granta recently published an anthology of contemporary Chinese literature. I did one short story, which happened to be by Mo Yen, the Nobel Prize winner of some time ago. Anyway, I suggested to Granta that they allow me to write a note, because there were so many subtle references there that I thought made the story more tragic, more powerful. But they didn't take me up on it. Partly because I think they were going to write their own introduction overall to all the stories and all the writers, which were all very different.
Yeah.
And mine would have stuck out if I'd added in something, but I would love to know how many people reading that story understood why something happened, why it had a particular impact, you know, why the father cut off his son's hand. It was deeply shocking, but it all made sense if you knew a bit about the history of class struggle in China, cruelties, social chaos, and so on, at a particular period. And then, with that information in your mind, you just read the story in a different way. So yes, but I don't do footnotes. I never have done footnotes. I don't think editors most of the time will. I wouldn't want to. But I think, and in fact, I once did a story with me and another translator about Xinjiang opera, Shanxi opera it was called. And we both wrote translator's notes, one at the beginning, one at the end. And his, this is the joy of co-translation, his was completely different from my note.
Excellent.
Mine was much more practical. His was about the author, why he was such a good author. And, you know, anybody could read it or not read it, or read both, read one, but, you know, they added a certain magic to the story, I think.
When I read this, I always thought to myself, am I missing something? But mainly it's because I was contextualizing it to Aneesa, the years.
Oh my goodness.
No. I was like, because that was my only experience that I've had of BookBlast before, basically. I gave that book to my mother, Aneesa, and she was laughing the entire way through. She was like, oh my god, this is amazing. I remember this time, my like all of the men of my family, they were around, and I was like, I did not get the same reaction from and we read it both in French, and so the way that she contextualized it was very different to the way that I contextualized. And so this discussion brought up my feeling of, am I reading this completely blankly? Am I missing a point? Because obviously it comes with a translation where would a Japanese person get a completely different take on it? Would a Japanese person of a certain age, would a Japanese person of a certain background, and all of that, and I was just like, I read it in one sitting. Easy to read cadence-wise, but quite difficult to interpret. And halfway through the first novella, I was like, let's stop trying to find a meaning of this. But at the same time, now that we're talking about it, it's like, what if there was symbolism? What if I just dug a little bit deeper? What if this could be something very big for the author? What if this could be a very important image for the culture, or even the individual?
I think one reason why it's kind of quite alien to us in Britain is that we don't have this we don't have this idea of animism, of spirits in physical objects. And oddly enough, I don't know if anyone's read that Marie Kondo book about tidying up. She says, say goodbye to your clothes, you know, and she also mentions these kamis as well, like these spirits. Actually, oddly enough, we do have that word in English, kamikaze, which means it's like kami and kaze is wind.
There was a publisher, I don't know if they're still around, called Kodansha, and Kodansha I used to read a lot of they published a lot of Japanese, and they had offices in New York and here. I think I might have put one of their I found an old Kodansha flyer, I think. Here we are. Here, Japanese fiction and literature, there's a lot of Murakami. So they started publishing Murakami, who was obviously, you know, picked up. And then you've got all kinds of people who actually haven't heard of: Crime, Rain in the Wind, Ghosts, Master, Assassin, What the Maid Saw. There we are, so all these publishing, the Showa, modern Japanese short stories. But this, of course, is an introduction, you see. And then, of course, an epic novel of the samurai era, of course, is always the samurais. A reader's guide to Japanese literature from the 8th century to the present.
Can I share a controversial
Anyway,
opinion?
so yeah, no, by all means, be
I
controversial,
actually
please.
quite enjoyed that there was no context.
Oh, you
to this
like it,
book.
yeah. Just you had to deal with it.
I actually
Yeah.
quite enjoyed it. I thought,
Yeah.
that, of course, it's interesting to see the threads with the culture and myth, and it's all very good and enriching in terms of learning the culture. But I thought that you can kind of look at it from a fresh perspective, from your own perspective, of your own background, and see common threads of humanity in it, like we did with the girl and the relationship and everything. But I thought I was reading it, I was actually kind of when I started reading the first novel, I was like, okay, this is going to be a really hard read, and I was really intentionally trying to visualize as much as I could in my head, and I enjoyed it, the randomness of it, absurdity, and not understanding properly what's going on. I felt as a reading experience, if you're really trying to immerse and visualize, that was actually almost like a benefit, not understanding the intellectual story behind it.
I think also another approach can be that if you're reading a book that you're baffled about from a certain translated from a certain language, but you're fascinated and you want to know more. I mean, I regard it as an invitation to go and
find more. That's the idea. I mean, that is the idea. More books.
By Japanese authors,
exactly.
From different periods at different times. Rather some when you travel somewhere, you might decide you're going to read the writers of that country in order to get an idea of the culture and the people, and also to be. I mean, it may seem quite banal to say it, but we've all got these now. We can sit just next to us. We don't have to go running down to the basement to look things up in the Encyclopedia Britannica. We can just when there's something that we want to know more about, it's very easy to look it up and get some. We can even say, "Hey Google, Siri or whatever."
I just thought of a funny example the other way around. Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass was translated at the beginning of the 20th century by a very famous Chinese translator into Chinese.
Oh, interesting.
And what on earth did Chinese readers make of pinafores and marmalade?
Smiling cats.
No introductory notes at all.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was
work?
a bestseller, and it is still in print.
Really?
It's been in print for 100 years. In favour of no context.
Yeah.
Because where do you start? Where on earth do you begin?
Exactly. Yeah. Any final thoughts?
Charming book. I loved it, and I'm pleased that we've
thank you.
for this book club.
Thank you all for your time and for an illuminating discussion. And thank you, Nicky Harman and Aneesa Higgins, for coming and giving us insights into the art of translation. At our BookBlast Translation Book Club in February, we're featuring S.J. Nord's Fathers and Fugitives, translated by Michael Haynes, published by Europa Editions. This podcast is brought to you by BookBlast. For more bookishness between episodes, visit online journal The BookBlast Diary or find us on Instagram at BookBlast Official. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the BookBlast podcast.